But in that moment of holding the death certificate, I had this experience. It was very intense, and it's something I like to call geographical confluence. Hi, I'm Susan Paterson, and I'm an author. So my book, Where Light Meets Water, is published by Simon and Schuster. Where Light Meets Water is a story of love and the transformative power of art set in the age of sail in the 19th century. It is set both at sea on the decks of tall ships and around the world from Scotland to London, Melbourne, and to the South Island of New Zealand. It follows the story of Thomas Rutherford, who is sent to sea at the age of 13 after his father is lost in a shipwreck. Tom has grown up at sea. It's all he's known. It's the height of his ambition, and he's determined to captain his own ship one day. When we meet Tom, we feel that his life is quite set on a particular path. However, on shore leave in London one day, he meets Catherine Ogilvie, who is a fellow artist from a very different world to Tom, a very privileged world, a very stifling world. Together, they form a bond over a shared love of art, but also over a mutual yearning for greater horizons. So, as the days tick down to Tom's departure from London, Tom is opened up to creative possibility, an emotional attachment on land, and to a competing ambition as an artist, which will urge him to choose between two worlds. This is my first published novel. I do have another novel manuscript in the drawer, as many authors do. It's not an uncommon story. And it was seriously read and considered by various people in the industry and ultimately didn't get across the line. But I'm really, really pleased and really proud to have this book as my first. I think it's a step up in achievement from the earlier book. The book was inspired by finding the death certificate of my great 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 grandfather, Captain Thomas Robertson, who was a ship's captain and an accomplished maritime oil painter. So, Captain Tom, as we call him in my family, was born in Scotland in 1819, and the death certificate showed that he died in Yokohama, Japan in 1873. We have no idea why he went to Japan, unfortunately. But in that moment of holding the death certificate, I had this experience. It was very intense, and it's something I like to call geographical confluence, which was a feeling of a mapping of journeys, of his journey and mine. So Captain Tom immigrated. He came from Scotland to Melbourne in the 1850s, and Melbourne's where I've made my home, and then on in the 1860s to Port Chalmers, which is the port of the city of Dunedin in New Zealand. And that's where I grew up. And at the time, I was also about to welcome my Japanese sister in law into my family. So there was just this acute sense of knowing that it was a seed of a novel. I had no idea what the story would be, who the characters would be, what would happen. I knew it wouldn't be family history, that it would be a novel, it would be fiction, it would be about a journey of discovery and an imaginative flight. But I definitely knew that was the start of something. And so from there, I sought out Captain Tom, so Thomas Robertson's paintings in galleries and various collections around Australia and New Zealand. So in Melbourne, for instance, in the State Library of Victoria and in the NGV, in Sydney, the National Maritime Museum, and then in various collections in New Zealand as well. And I chose to give some of those paintings to my character, Thomas Rutherford. The book is set all around the world and specifically London, Melbourne, and Dunedin in New Zealand, and Port Chalmers. I was really lucky that I had traveled to all of these places. In fact, I grew up in Dunedin and I've spent now 20 years living in Melbourne. So I know the environments quite intimately. And I was very inspired by the landscape. You know, the land and the sea is so important, obviously, in this book. And it was wonderful to be able to go back in time and see these places as they were, so, all these years ago. So through the historical records with newspapers and paintings and of photographs where they existed a little bit later on, and kind of investigate the current events, the circumstances, the environment, the language of the time, what was important to people in these moments. But having lived in these places, I wanted to infuse the book with my deep love of the landscape, and specifically, of course, of that coastal environment in along Dunedin's coastline, the beach, the light, the sea, that sort of intense luminous atmosphere. So I did grow up in a coastal environment in Dunedin in New Zealand. So we've got both the harbour and also the Pacific coastline. It's a surf beach. It's beautiful. It's stunning. Um, we had a boat when I grew up. Of course, it was not a tall sailing ship. It was a motorboat, and mainly we went out on the lake around central Otago. I think that's really where my love of the water came from. Um, and then, wild, sort of windy walks along the beach as well. I think there's something about that power of the surf as well, something that speaks to your breath. So I did go out on a tall ship. It was a bark, and it was an incredible experience, and it gave me a huge sense of the scale. These the masts and the yards are absolutely enormous, and the work that is done on the rigging aloft is incredible. I got to haul on a line, so you could feel, the girth of this rope and the friction on your hands and the weight of it, and that, you had to really listen to instructions on board, because if you hold on too long, you'll be pulled along with it. So that gave me somewhat of a good sense of the kinds of that experiential, the feeling of being on a ship that Tom would have on that first journey in particular. And then, in addition to that, I did a heap of research, everything from novels written by sailors. So, for instance, Joseph Conrad was a sailor. He wrote a beautiful book called The Shadow Line. And in particular, an author called Richard Henry Dana, who wrote 2 years before the mast, which is a memoir of his first 2 years on board a sailing ship. He was a student from Harvard who was instructed by his doctors that his eyesight was poor and that he ought to take a break from studying. So he joined up as a deckhand and traveled from Boston around the Horn to California in 1832 to 1834. And he also wrote, very fortuitously, a handbook called A Manual of Seamen's Terms. Pretty sure that's what it's called. And this gave me everything that I needed from all of the parts of the ship: the rigging, the sails, the knots, the spars, the foresails, forestays, the shrouds, the different hierarchies and positions on board, what each person was responsible for, what they did, how to tack and make different maneuvers, how to weigh anchor, how to do all these things, practically speaking. So that was an absolute boon to find that. So combination of experience, feeling, and research. I am not an artist. I am an avid lover of art. I have spent many hours in galleries around the world, really looking at art, absorbing art, experiencing art. And I wanted that feeling to come across in the book. But I did do some training, I suppose. I enrolled in an introductory course. I learned how to mix paints and prepare the canvas and block out my picture initially. And I dabbled with some painting on my own and with a friend. But outside of that, I read about different artists, and a great book on Victorian women artists in particular. I watched lots of YouTube videos about how to mix paints and apply color. And it was just a sort of a process, I think, of transposing my own creative experience as an author onto that of a visual artist. So that experience of being so engrossed in the creative flow that the world falls away and it's just you with your eye, your hand, your heart, your mind in sync. So Catherine takes Tom to the Gallery early on in the book to see a JMW Turner painting, Snowstorm Steamboat off a Harbour's Mouth, which is a painting from 1846, I think, when it was exhibited at the Royal Academy exhibition. And this painting is an incredible swirl of it's white paint, grey, umber, and out of the sort of abstract chaos of it is this slightly discernible outline of what is probably the steamship at the heart of the storm. And Turner was said to have painted this after being after he requested they lash him to the mast so that he could experience this painting. The critics said that it was all whitewash and soap suds. It was quite misunderstood. Um, but Turner was all about painting the experience rather than how a painting could be understood. So, for when Tom and Catherine stand before this painting, they have both very different experiences of it, but it also unites them. So it's sort of a transference point between artist and viewer of emotion and experience. So while Tom looks at this painting and he sees his own childhood reflected, all the chaos and the newness of and the grief and the disorientation that he felt on those first moments aboard a ship, and in particular on his first battling against the elements in a storm, while Catherine sees this freedom and this wildness, and it triggers this yearning in her for something more than what she is permitted as a Victorian woman. So Catherine Ogilvie is very much a woman chafing against the constraints of Victorian society and the expectations and limitations placed upon her. And in particular, she experiences this as a Victorian woman artist who has ambition that goes well beyond mere feminine accomplishment. So at this time, of course, women are encouraged to be accomplished. And when I talk about her, I am talking specifically about an upper class woman, because class obviously cuts through all experiences, and in particular, it's very strong at this time. Um, but Catherine Ogilvie comes from a society where feminine accomplishment is something that is done. You know, you ought to be good at painting and piano and singing, but in a way that's sort of non-threatening and doesn't involve any personal ambition, in a way that will make you more marriageable, will enable you to entertain in society more ably. Women have very little in the way of freedom. They have no financial or legal independence. There's no room for ambition beyond being a kind of domestic angel, which was held up um, as you know, the thing of aspiration for women. They're barred from a lot of education. Catherine's unable to train or to study in the Royal Academy schools, which is sort of the epicenter of the Victorian artistic world at this time. Unlike the young men who she sees learning and training and developing their skill and being encouraged, she in fact meets with discouraging comments. But that's also where she finds a kinship with Tom, and that because Tom's grown up outside of this society, he is in a position where he's quite open to her ambition and, in fact, supports it. I had not thought about risk um, until this moment, but in fact, risk is a big theme of the novel. When we first meet my character, Tom, he is caught up in a catastrophic storm and he is working aloft the mast, taking in a sail. And we see that the life of a sailor is very much about everyday risk, so much so that a sailor becomes inured to that risk and to that danger. And you have to, there's only so much fear you can take on before you can't cope with it. You have to just sort of normalize it. So, on one hand, Tom is quite accustomed to risk of a particular kind, and he feels that if he were to die in a storm like this, the only thing he would regret at that moment is that he didn't get a chance to paint it. So and then as a painter, he is untrained. He is plucked, I guess, by Catherine, and she is almost training him and helping him to find his way as a painter. Um, but he can see the risk involved, as many artists do, of all kinds, when you produce a work of art or you write a book and you put that out into the public sphere and it becomes something other. It is separate to you. It is an object of its own that is then subject to scrutiny, to comments and critique about what is appropriate art, what is good art, what is bad art. And for Tom, he's quite aware of his humble beginnings, and he can feel this sort of the way that his birth would be apparent in this world, that he feels it's a very exposing action. And risk, I suppose, ultimately, Tom takes the risk of love in the book. It's the greatest risk for him. And of course, with that risk comes the risk of loss. So when writing a male protagonist, I wanted to give Tom the full range of emotions and experience and relationships, just as I would a woman. And in the end, for both writing Tom and for Catherine, I really wrote them with a sense of the androgynous artist. I wanted them to have both masculine and feminine so-called qualities, especially, we're dealing with a period in time where gender roles are so rigid and the expectations upon men and women are so stifling. I wanted to portray their inner worlds, the world of Tom and Catherine, merely as humans with a range of attributes and qualities and strengths and weaknesses, sensitivities. So Catherine is outspoken and headstrong in ways that Tom is not. Tom is quite a sensitive character for someone who also faces great danger and adversity in his life. I did enjoy this experience. I mean, you have to enjoy this experience or you would not do it. I wrote this book over about 8.5 years. I researched as I wrote in tandem. That was not always straightforward. And certainly there were many times of despair and doubt, and trying to pick my way through difficulties, to learn new skills, to take on board feedback, um, to make sense of what it was I was trying to write about and who these characters were, and make sense of the world that I'd placed them in. Um, but ultimately, it has been the most exhilarating and fulfilling process that I could possibly do. And in terms of the highs always come when there's a point of connection with a reader. And so, luckily, at the moment, I'm getting the wonderful opportunity to reach out to readers. And at an earlier time, that was when I received my advanced copies, and that got sent out to authors who I really admired, and their comments and support, it just meant the world to me. It was a real high. I do have a day job, and I do have to write outside that day job. Um, Luckily, when I'm in a period of creative flow, I get quite obsessed. So, I might be writing in my phone at 3 a.m. because I've woken up with an idea. Or, I'll get up and I'll be making my coffee still in my pajamas, and then suddenly I'm at my computer, and then 4 hours later, I've not really, I have to fit it in on, weekends, the days that I'm not working my day job as a writer and editor, nights, evenings. I give up social events so that I can write, when I'm really I've got a deadline or I'm really in the flow of things. So, yeah, I think most writers have to work hard to make time to write. I have just started reading Maggie O'Farrell's The Marriage Portrait, which is set in 16th century Italy and follows the very short life of Lucrezia de Medici. And it's based on the Robert Browning poem, My Last Duchess. And I loved Maggie O'Farrell's Hamnet. So I'm really looking forward to getting further into this book. I really love her lyricism and the way that she writes into the gaps in history and deals with women in history and also quite domestic detail as well. So yeah, that's absolutely, I'm kind of gripped by that at the moment. I'm really looking forward to writing my next book, to finding, I've got my antenna out and I've got some ideas, and it's far too early and nascent to really talk about it, but I just can't wait till I have a bit of space to sit down and let my imagination free again in a way that feels sort of fresh and new. I'm pretty sure that I'm writing historical fiction again. There may be some similar preoccupations, no doubt, and quite likely with a female protagonist, but all to be sorted out in all good time. Thank you so much for having me at the Leaf Bookshop. It's been a thrill to talk to you.